Welcome to A Way Forward, the podcast where I sit down and have real discussions about the challenges we face in our cities, communities, and neighborhoods. The goal of this podcast is to create a space that includes expert interviews, guests with lived experiences, and voices not often heard. I'm your host, retired Police Chief Daniel Hahn, and I will bring my experience in law enforcement, community, and education to each conversation so that together we can build a way forward. As 34 years in law enforcement, I've gone to numerous community meetings, community functions, and no matter what neighborhood it was in, whether it was a high crime neighborhood, a neighborhood experiencing high levels of crime, or a neighborhood not experiencing much crime, the issue of public safety, family safety, crime always came up. It was always an issue in every community meeting I've ever attended. Also, when you think about political campaigns, safety, crime is always a central issue. When you look at the polling in neighborhoods, whether it's a campaign that's coming up or whatever it might be, when we poll, safety is always one of the top concerns of people that are polled when it comes to what are their priorities in the neighborhood. Even the last presidential election, if you believe the experts that are on national news programs talking about what the highest, most prevalent issues in the campaign, typically we hear economy, crime, and immigration. And immigration, a lot of times, a lot of the concerns surrounding immigration is revolving around crime. So as we think about this, what have we done in regards to making our neighborhoods safer, our families safer, reducing crime, and those sort of things, since it comes up so often? And if you look back to 2011 to now, at least in my lifetime, we've had the most significant changes or reform when it comes to the criminal justice system. For example, in 2011, we had AB 109, or otherwise called the California Public Safety Realignment Act. It shifted the responsibility of supervising nonviolent, non-serious, non-sex offenders. It shifted that from the state, in other words, the prison system, parole agents, to the counties, which was typically the sheriff's department or the probation department. That came with a lot of issues. So jails, for example, that house people at the local level, run by the sheriff's department, were now taking custody of people that had previously been in a prison, a state prison. Jails were built to house people up to a year, predominantly for people awaiting trial. They were not built for people to serve 20 plus years in. And if you look at a state prison, they look much different than a jail. They have yards, they have technical training, they have all sort of resources for people that are going to be housed or incarcerated for 20 plus years. Jails don't have that. Then in 2014, we passed Prop 47, in other words, called the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act. It reclassified certain crimes from felonies to misdemeanors, such as drug possession of cocaine, heroin, and others. It also, prior to Prop 47, if you got arrested multiple times for shoplifting, petty theft, eventually it would become a felony. It did away with that. So you could get arrested numerous times and it would never become a felony. Then we had Prop 57 in 2016. It was passed by the voters by 65%. It allowed for the release of 30,000 convicted nonviolent individuals from our state institutions. Things such as rape by intoxication, rape of an unconscious person, human trafficking crimes, and assault. All these things centered on the criminal justice system. All these things were, one, to reduce the population in prison, which was overcrowded, and judges were starting to take action about the overcrowding in prisons. But it was also all meant to make our neighborhoods safer. In other words, for example, Prop 47 was called the Safe Neighborhood and Schools Act. So they were all sold as making us safer. Well, and then recently, last year in 2024, frustration building, crime rising. It wasn't unusual to see groups of people walking into malls and stores and stealing things and leaving. And the image was that it went without any repercussions. And so law enforcement leaders started to speak out about the negative consequences of these reform measures, Prop 47, AB 109, Prop 57. And law enforcement leaders put forward Prop 36 in 2024, and it passed by 68%. I think that shows the level of frustration of the voters with what was taking place at the time. And it repealed many of the things in Prop 47. It increased the penalties for repeat shoplifters. It required prison time for certain felony convictions, such as drug dealing. And it also allowed for convicted persons that were convicted of illegal drug possession of what it is called treatment mandatory felony, which says if you complete drug treatment, then your charges are dismissed. So it adds a social services component, or how do we get you off of drugs? Then recently, just in the last month or two, and I think February 2025, one of our lawmakers put forward AB 1333, which was introduced and sought to address gun violence and rising armed vigilantism. It proposed to put into law that certain circumstances of homicide would not be justifiable. For example, if you are outside your own home and knowing that deadly force could be avoided if you retreated from whatever was threatening you or your family, that no longer was justifiable if you used deadly force on somebody trying to break into your house or something along those lines. It also said that mutual combat, if you are fighting with somebody and if you were the one that started it, that if somebody died in the course of that it would not be justifiable anymore. You could be charged with homicide. So my question is, all these things, how does that really address the issue of safety and crime in our neighborhood? And it's a question we should all be asking ourselves. So before we get into that, let's talk about who makes up our prison population. So in 2023, the Public Policy Institute of California writes a report like they typically do and described the prison population in the state of California. Our prison population in 2023 was 94,200 individuals incarcerated in our state prison system. The peak population of our prison system was in 2006, where we held almost double that, 173,000 people incarcerated in our prisons. 96% of the people in prison are men, 46% Latino, 28% Black, 20% white. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, in 2003, 68% of those incarcerated in our state prison system had not obtained a high school diploma. 68%. According to other groups, adults in poverty are 3 times more likely to be arrested. There are many reasons for that. One, if you live in an impoverished neighborhood, the calls for service to the local police department are probably higher, and so therefore there's more police officers in that neighborhood. Amongst the high crime in that neighborhood, amongst the lack of resources for educational institutions in that neighborhood, there's many probably factors that play into that. According to the Brookings Institute in 2018, 3 years prior to any incarceration, only 49% of those incarcerated were employed. So prior to somebody being incarcerated, only 49% of those folks had jobs 3 years leading up to their incarceration. And those that did have those jobs, the median annual income was $6,250. Boys who grew up in families in the bottom 10% of family income, which is less than $14,000 a year, were 20 times more likely to be in prison in their 30s. So what does this say? This says to me that poverty, which numerous studies show, is a ripe place for crime to increase. Poverty is one of the factors that makes crime more likely. Education, lack of education, lack of opportunities, lack of jobs, and what I would say is a lack of hope. If I don't have hope for a brighter future, then what's stopping me from committing a crime today? So all the solutions over the last 10, 15 years have been primarily focused on the criminal justice system. So law enforcement, police departments, sheriff's departments, probation departments, the courts, the district attorney's office, sentencing, and those sort of things. But when you look at the population of who's in custody, poverty is a driving factor. Lack of education is a driving factor. And all the things that come with poverty, the challenges that come from living in an impoverished neighborhood. I grew up in an impoverished neighborhood. I saw violence every day outside of our door. I witnessed my first murder when I was 9 years old. These things are commonplace in most of our impoverished neighborhoods across our country. So the question would be, what are we doing in order to improve our impoverished neighborhoods? Because if you look at every impoverished neighborhood across our country, they haven't always been impoverished. Things like urban renewal, housing discrimination such as redlining, things like housing or freeway construction in the 60s and 50s created these pockets of poverty that used to be thriving neighborhoods. The neighborhood I grew up in used to be thriving prior to me living there, and now to this day, it is an impoverished neighborhood. And so when we look about how do we improve on the safety of our neighborhoods, whether we're an impoverished neighborhood or a wealthy neighborhood, we need to do a couple things. We need to not forget the short term, which is law enforcement, enforcing our laws, holding people accountable. I'm not saying that we should not do that. We should hold people accountable. If somebody victimizes somebody else, there should be accountability. But the reality is we're going to continue to have neighborhoods that feed crime and feed these things that we want to improve on unless we start addressing poverty. We took out economic vitality out of many of our neighborhoods. Our schools are struggling with lower resources than other schools. Until we address those things, we will continue to have a neighborhood that assists in crime. And lastly, I'll say, in the last several years, I've seen an increase in division. The division that says we should either send a social worker to an issue such as mental health or homelessness, or we should send a police officer, not both. We have to work collaboratively. Law enforcement, the criminal justice system can assist in helping people with drug rehabilitation. Law enforcement system can assist with getting people the resources that they need for their mental health. And when people are in mental health crisis in our neighborhoods, oftentimes that's also a safety issue. If I'm in mental health crisis and I have a knife or a gun, that's a safety issue, not only to the person in mental health crisis, but to the people that are responding to it and to the neighborhood that it's occurring in. So I really think we should be thinking about how do we not only address the immediate, holding people accountable for victimizing somebody else today, but also how do we improve on poverty? How do we improve our school system in all of our neighborhoods? Because what gives me hope at all times that we can do this is we, people, are the ones that created these pockets of poverty. So we, people, can increase the economic vitality of neighborhoods. We can increase the job opportunities of certain neighborhoods. We can improve the education quality in certain neighborhoods. And in the long run, that will be the best fight against crime and the factors that lower our safety in our neighborhoods. And so as we look at our lawmakers, our policymakers, our community leaders, we should be asking ourselves, what am I doing to improve my neighborhood? What are we doing to improve all neighborhoods in regards to poverty, economic vitality, our education system? How do we get people the resources, the knowledge, and the training that they need, that they too can support their families and they can live productive, thriving lives, which we all want to do. It is not certain groups of people that are predisposed to crime or violence. It is the circumstances that surround us that are contributing factors to that. Until we do something about those things, we will continue to struggle with crime, violence, and poverty in some of our neighborhoods. So if you're listening to some of this and you're asking yourself, which I think a lot of times we all do, what can I do? Okay, that all makes sense. I've heard it. What can I do? Well, here's some things to think about. When you're driving through the different neighborhoods of your city, and you look around and say, this neighborhood looks different than that neighborhood. I think we all can ask ourselves, why is that? So if you just take the neighborhood I grew up in, it used to be a thriving business district. People used to call it the second downtown, where people would come from other neighborhoods into the neighborhood I grew up in to do their shopping, which brings people to spend money in restaurants, brings people to spend money at businesses. Those businesses provide jobs for people in the neighborhood. The state fairgrounds used to be in this neighborhood. Then all those things left for various reasons. Freeway construction, move it to a different neighborhood, the jobs went away. When I was growing up, there wasn't even a supermarket in our neighborhood. We had to go to another neighborhood to go shopping. And so the jobs went away. And so poverty set in. And then crime came. It wasn't the other way around. So as we look at certain neighborhoods, think about what could be built in this neighborhood. This neighborhood is zoned for gas stations, liquor stores, and things like that. You go to another neighborhood, and you find it interesting, you don't see any of those things because they're not allowed in that other neighborhood. And so the way a neighborhood looks is often due to the laws and the policies and the zoning of that neighborhood allows for the detrimental things to be in that neighborhood when it doesn't allow the detrimental things to be in other neighborhoods. So one of the things we could do is think about what would bring these neighborhoods back from poverty to a thriving neighborhoods. Jobs, businesses, economic development. And you think in your city, what neighborhoods are concentrating on economic development and what neighborhoods are kind of left behind. And so how do we share that wealth? How do we think about those things in the neighborhood that used to have them that doesn't have them any longer? And then when you drive by the schools, drive by some schools in the thriving neighborhoods and drive by schools in impoverished neighborhoods. All you have to do is drive by. They look totally different. The resources are totally different. And I am one that believes that no matter where my child grows up, they should have the same opportunities as other people in terms of education. Then it's up to them whether they go to class and whether they thrive. But if we start out at a deficit, then those kids have to work that much harder just to get what other kids get normally. And so, what can we do? We can ask those questions, especially if we live in these communities. What are we doing to bring jobs and opportunities to my neighborhood? What are we doing to bring healthy things to my neighborhood, supermarkets, as opposed to fast food restaurants? What are we doing to improve the long-term outlook of this neighborhood? And the bottom line is we've got to work together as an entire city or as an entire community. We can no longer leave neighborhoods behind. So if we work together, we can all find a way forward to a better tomorrow for all people.